couple of weeks ago, I said to Bro, I said, do we have anybody speaking on June 15th? And he says, you want to speak? And I said, I want to be the speaker. I don't want to speak, but I want to be the speaker because I wanted to be here. I knew today I really needed to be here. I had actually prepared some to talk about being authentic. Steve and I were talking about that a little earlier. But I think I'd like to start with kind of giving you my story. And some of you know it. I see a lot of new faces in here that don't know it. But I'd like to kind of update what's going on in my life and also bring up how I got to where I am. Well, I was raised not too far from here in Pasadena, actually Altadena, but no one's ever heard of Altadena, so I say Pasadena. But and I grew up in a Christian home, or maybe that's not even right. I used to think it was a Christian home. Now I kind of think it was a churchian home. We were wedded to the church. Big, the big C, our church that we went to, not the church of all of us. But we went to church a lot. Sunday mornings, we went to Sunday school for an hour and a half, and we went to church for an hour and a half, and then we would go home and have lunch, and then we'd come back, and we'd go to, back then it was called Christian Endeavor on Sunday nights, and then we'd go Wednesday nights to prayer meeting, and then Friday nights was also a big social time for the high school kids. So I grew up in the church home.
Lutheran church? Sounds just like
It was a congregational church, but congregational is really not a theology. It's more of a structure. So it just means it's run from the bottom up instead of from the top down, like the Presbyterians top down, Catholics are top down, congregational churches are bottom up, so that you vote on everything. Everything is voted on. But it was a Bible-believing evangelical congregational church, which is not the norm for congregational churches. But anyway, that's where I grew up. Always believing the story of Jesus. Jesus was sent by God to a virgin birth, and he lived on earth as a man. And then he was executed wrongly, improperly. And then he was buried. And then he was buried on a Friday evening, and then he rose again on Sunday morning, on the third day. And that's what I believed. And so I thought, well, this is good stuff, right? I wasn't a very good student, and I didn't have college plans. I had never taken the SAT or any of that. So I got out of high school and didn't really know what to do, so I joined the Army with one of my best friends, who joined the Marines the same day. We both enlisted, and we both wanted to go to Vietnam. And I told the enlistment sergeant that I wanted to go to Vietnam. I wanted to be in the infantry. I wanted to carry a gun and shoot bad guys. And I wanted to be a paratrooper, because I thought that was a really studly thing to do. So my friend, he joined the Marines because he'd always wanted to be a Marine. And then we went on our separate ways a couple days later. So I enlisted when I was 18. The military back then, at least the Army, it was a strange place. It was during the height of the Vietnam War. And actually, my friend and I, we decided to enlist because the Vietnam War wasn't going very well for America, and we thought the two of us, very bright, strong, energetic guys, could go over there and win this war. But what happened to me is I ended up in basic training in Fort Bliss, Texas, one of 6 Californians with a company of Texans. And that was not a pleasant thing to experience, because they thought all of us were what we say gay today, but we were all queer. But I was able to convince them that I wasn't by outperforming everybody but one person in my company on the physical test. So they figured, well, you can't have a queer be faster and stronger than me. So I wasn't queer anymore. But the other thing that happened, there while I was in while I was in basic training is I got called into the squad bay and said I'd been selected to go to OCS. Well, by then I had volunteered for all kinds of stuff: Ranger School, Special Forces, Flight School. And this was another thing to volunteer for. I'm gung ho. Yeah, I'll go to OCS. I didn't really understood what all that meant, but I was selected, and I ended up going. Remember, I told you I wasn't a very good student. I got stopped my first week in OCS, which is Officers Candidate School, for those of you who don't recognize that. And the officer asked me, he said, well, so you want to be a lieutenant? And I said, yes. He said, well, why don't you spell lieutenant for me? I couldn't spell it. He eventually asked me, he also asked me about colonel. I couldn't spell that. But then he asked me, can you spell private? And I said, Private. He said, yeah, that's correct, and that's what you're going to be. But I learned to spell lieutenant, and oddly enough, even though I had volunteered for Vietnam, I was sent to Korea. And Korea in 1967 was not a pleasant place to be. Those of you who are old enough maybe remember January of '68 was the Pueblo, or USS Pueblo was captured. So there was hostilities going on. We actually had 3 men in my battalion killed in an ambush while I was there. But while I was there, my friend, who joined the Marines, had been sent to Vietnam. And about November of '67, I got word that he had been wounded mortally and was probably going to die. And I thought, well, the deal was we were going to go to Vietnam and win this war, and I didn't do my part, so I volunteered again. And even in the Army in those days, you didn't have to volunteer more than twice. And I got sent then to Vietnam. I had already been to jump school because I wanted to be a paratrooper. And I got there right at the end of Tet, and the Americans then went on the offensive right away. It's like the Ukrainians, it's a counteroffensive. You usually do that immediately, so you catch the attackers off guard, or at least in a more vulnerable position than in a defensive position. But several things happened. One was a really good thing. In early April, I had the opportunity to lead a search and rescue team to rescue some a helicopter crew. And that was all good stuff. May was a really tough month. Those of you who know anything about the Vietnam War, May '68 was the month we lost more Americans killed than any other month. '68 was the year we lost more Americans killed than any other year. And May was just like that for me. We were in constant contact. Almost every day. We were doing some sort of air assault into the jungle. On June 15th, 1968, 55 years ago today, I got asked to do a special mission with just my platoon, and we were airlifted out near the Ashaw Valley, and we were told to find a rocket launcher. Look for a rocket launcher from this area, and so we did. And we got to a point where we actually made contact with some North Vietnamese, and there were only 2 of them, so it was dispatched pretty quickly. And we found the rocket launcher, but we didn't find the rockets. And so I said, well, we need to find the rockets. That's more important than the rocket launcher. So let's take one squad at a time, and we'll go down the hill and start looking around for the rockets. And so I decided that I would lead a light platoon, a light squad. So it was like 7 riflemen, a machine gunner and rifleman, and my radio operator. And I set off to go find these rockets. And it had been raining, and we started sliding down these hills. They were much steeper than the map showed, and we ended up sliding into a North Vietnamese base. And the firefight started, and it was the most horrific experience of my life. The 7 members of the squad, during the next 2 to 3 hours, I don't even remember how long it was, ended up all dying being shot. And I saw each one of them. I saw each one of them as they were shot. And then my radio operator got shot in the armpit, and he was starting to bleed out. So I called in for an airstrike. And maybe I have this confused with another time, but maybe it was artillery. But anyway, I had to call it in pretty close to our position. I got behind a tree. The explosive went off about 50 feet in front of me, but I was behind a tree, trying to keep my radio operator alive. That ended the firefight because the explosive hit right where they were. And another unit of my company eventually found us, and we put by then my radio operator had died. So 8 of them that day died. And I went to Vietnam with having grown up in a Christian church. I knew some verses, and I knew Philippians 1:21, and it says, Paul's in prison, and he may be executed, and he says, but you know what, guys, it's okay, because if I stay alive, I get to live for Christ, but if I die, that's even better. So the Tim Lickness paraphrase of that is, death is underrated for us Christians. And I had that in my heart. I had that in my mind. And I wasn't scared my first 3.5 months in Vietnam. I really wasn't. So somehow I got back to our base camp, and I was covered in blood and mud and goop and stuff all over me from the insect repellents and all the stuff. And I was covered with blood, and so people were asking me, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay." That actually was my radio operator's blood. I was not wounded. I was not hurt. Well, I was not wounded physically. And I changed clothes and I cleaned up, and I couldn't go to dinner. I couldn't eat. This was a camp where we actually they had a mess hall or a mess tent. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. And that night I got scared, and I got so scared I was shaking, and all I could think of was I was afraid to die. I wasn't afraid until that night, but I was afraid to die. And I go, what is wrong with me? Where's my faith? I thought it was okay to die. In fact, I thought it was better to die, and now I'm afraid. I said, I'm not a good Christian. I'm not a faithful man. And I'm not a good leader. I just led these 8 guys into a firefight that we had no chance of getting out of. And so I spent the rest of my time in Vietnam for another 3 months until I got evacuated to a hospital in Japan. A whole other story, but I really couldn't sleep anymore. I had a hard time sleeping. I stopped eating much, and I had a reputation for eating everything that was put in front of me, including sea rations or anything that the cooks would throw in front of us. I would eat everything. And if you tried to put your tray back with food on it, I would take your tray and eat that too. But I couldn't eat, and I was losing weight. And eventually, I said, I went to a hospital in Japan, and I couldn't sleep there either. I had a hard time. And then eventually they decided not to send me back to Vietnam, and I ended up going home, and I was stationed at Fort Ord, and I was having trouble up there with the experiences I just come from. And then I got out and decided it was time to go to college. But remember, I'm not a good student, and I didn't have an SAT. So I made a list of schools that would accept me, that I sent out letters, try to get accepted or applied. And then I made a list of all the schools that accepted me, and that's where I ended up going, because they had a program especially for veterans. And at the time I thought, well, this is a good program because they realized we're a little bit more mature. Maybe we didn't have a good high school experience, and now we're more mature. But then I also realized all of us had the GI Bill, which could be sent directly to the school. But anyway, I actually got through college, and then I always wanted to be a lawyer, so I applied to law school, and I eventually got into a law school here in Los Angeles. But I wasn't sleeping. Every night I had the same nightmare, every single night. And it was the faces of those 8 men, 7 of them actually coming toward me, like just this expression of just blank. I might almost say zombie-like, but it was just like, it was so frightening because they were coming toward me. They were images of just them coming toward me, and I couldn't get the images out of my mind. But then 7 years later, after I'd gone to college and law school, and I was a young lawyer here in Los Angeles, and I went to a party. Lawyers seem to always have parties to go to. And I had never in my life had a drink of alcohol. Just wasn't done in my family. Now, there were some secret drinkers in my family, but when I was younger, I didn't know about it. But so I had never had a drink, but I went to this party, and someone just handed me a glass of wine, and I thought, well, I mean, even Jesus drank wine. I mean, can't be bad, right? So I drank this. It was a pretty big glass of wine, and something happened that night that hadn't happened in a long time, and that is I fell asleep, and I slept good. And I thought, I have found the elixir. I have found the magic potent. I have found a way to fall asleep, because I had tried. I had been to school counselors. I had been to the VA, and nobody knew. PTSD had not been coined, at least as far as any of these people I knew. They didn't know what to do with me. I couldn't sleep at night. I would have these nightmares. I would start shaking during the day. I was having flashbacks, and I was blaming, myself for not having any faith. But then I had this drink, and I fell asleep, and I thought, well, that's easy. Just have a glass of wine, and I'll fall asleep. And that actually worked until it took 2 glasses of wine. And that worked until it took 3. And eventually got to the point where I was drinking a full bottle of wine at 9:30, 9:45 at night in order to fall asleep. The problem with that is that's just too much liquid for my small bladder. So even though I'd follow the wine, the whole bottle would put me out. I don't know if I was asleep or just my mind was disengaged. But I said, I can't stay asleep because I have too much liquid in me. And but then I discovered something else that I didn't know about, something called proof. You could actually you could drink less liquid and actually get more alcohol. That's what proof is. I could get as much alcohol with much less liquid. Just take some really strong drink like vodka and then sweeten it up. And then you could just get it down. But I didn't do this until 9:45 at night because I only needed to sleep. And of course, I thought I was fooling everybody, including my wife, who just happens to have a nose like a bloodhound. She can smell alcohol after I eat corn nuts. And I used to do that. I'd go in and I would go in and take a shower and I'd drink all this alcohol, and then I would come out, eat some corn nuts and brush my teeth, and she goes, "You're drinking." She knew what was going on, and that resulted in me being secretive and being a liar. Because I was lying. I said, "No, I'll stop. I'm not. I don't need this," but I did. That's okay with me. I don't care. But I kept drinking, and I did that for decades. And one of the problems with doing that was it's really hard to come before God when you're drunk or hungover. And feeling guilty. I knew I wasn't walking the way I should be. So I know I needed to change it. And that gets me to a verse I came across. Actually, I was with John Brayton, I forgot John, but and we were at a men's event over at his church, and someone came up with one of the verses that I read there that I'd read before, but I didn't really understand it much. But it's John 14:12 through 14, and I'll just paraphrase it. But basically, Jesus has risen from the grave, and he's among his disciples. And these people at that time, they're pretty shook up. These disciples, they're now they see Jesus is alive, but he's telling them, I'm leaving. Well, they've been following this guy for several years, and he was their leader, and he said, I'm going to go be with the Father. But here's the deal. I'm leaving you behind to do my work. And to do my work even greater than what I've been doing. And I go, well, how could that be? And I'm not doing that. And then I thought, what does this mean? Because he actually ends it by saying, ask anything in my name and I will do it. So all of this had to be kind of parsed out. And by the way, if you get into some of these verses that you don't understand, you need to get expert help, a concordance, or talk to somebody who's been trained, like Sam or Cy and Marty, people who are trained in the Bible, because sometimes this guy's stuff gets confusing to those of us who aren't biblically trained. But I'm supposed to do greater things than Jesus? Oh, I can't do that. One of the thoughts that went through my mind was maybe some of you are old enough that maybe when you were at some point in your life, in your educational life, that you were forced to read Tale of Two Cities. But I used to think, well, my life is the tale of two Tims. I got this 9:45 at night Tim that could get up really early in the morning and kind of sober up on BART on the way to downtown San Francisco where I was working. And I kind of got through my day. I was actually a pretty successful lawyer, but I wasn't walking with God. But now I knew I'm supposed to be walking with God, but I'm not. I couldn't, because I wasn't being authentic. At least half my life was phony. Actually, the drinking part was real. The other part was phony. But several years ago, and some of you have heard this part, I went back to Vietnam, and while I was there, I was really praying that things would change in my life. And that's a whole story. I actually, if you go on YouTube, you can actually find it, because Greg videoed my talk when I got back from Vietnam. But God really spoke to me, and he said, the problem isn't you and what your memories, all this. The problem is you and me. Your problem isn't what's going on in your mind. Your problem is that we're not having the conversations like we should, Tim. You need to. It was almost like a dad saying, come on, you know what to do. I'm here for you, but you gotta walk with me. You just. And so I did, and that's been helpful. But I still get kicked in the stomach. I got kicked yesterday. We have some issues going on with our family, and it got a little worse yesterday, even though it's been terrible for the last 2.5 years. Hard to get through. Actually, it wasn't for some of you in here. I don't know what I've done in the last 5 years. Someone comes and sits with you, and he's just babbling on for, I don't know how many hours you were there, and he didn't have to say anything. He's just there. Sometimes we just need to be there, guys. But things are really getting tough now. You walk out that door, and the devil's going to meet you right at the door. Amen. We're in a fight. And we have to be the tip of the spear. We got to be out there. And we haven't been. At least I haven't been. But 2 weeks ago, Cy spoke to us, and he's Army guy, and he talked about being soldiers and you obey commands. The verse I just read from John, I kind of thought, well, maybe this isn't a command, but if nothing else, it's an observation. Jesus is saying, if you believe in me, I'll know because you'll do my work. So maybe it's just an observation, or maybe it's a command. I don't know. It doesn't make any difference, really. But that's what we got to step up now, guys. I want to be respectful. We want to have some time at the end. Marty. The last song you sang. There's a verse in Hosea. I think it's Hosea 6:6, and I have to paraphrase it, but you want to, you can look it up later. But this is God talking to Hosea. And he's saying, I don't want your offerings. I want you to know me. I don't want your sacrifices. I want you to love me. She mentioned both those things. So thank you for that. That was just reminders. I actually planned to talk about being authentic. And let me just tell you one of the stories I've shared with a lot of people. Camp Pendleton, I use this as an example for the men. And that as I used to go with the guy, we go down to Mexico and build houses. And he was a real carpenter. He knew what he was doing. And he's a big guy, not much taller than me, but big, broad shoulders. And he's got arms that are bigger than my legs. And he knows what he's doing. And so we were actually working on multiple houses down there. And while we were eating lunch, some teenagers from the little village wherever we were, someplace between Tijuana and about 20 miles south of Tijuana. I'm not sure exactly where we were. But these teenagers came and they stole our tools, our power tools. And I said to my friend John, I said, John, they're taking our tools. And he looked up and he was eating a sandwich and he goes, yeah, you sure are. I said, well, aren't we going to do anything? He says, yeah, we're going to do something. And he just kept eating his sandwich and drinking our water. And then after he finished, he kind of goes like this. He said, okay, let's go. He said, help me put my generator and my compressor in the back of the truck, and we'll drive down. So we watched them. We could see them go for about a half mile. We could see where they went in. So we drove down there, and I told him, I said, John, I'm right behind you, big guy. And I thought we were going to get in a fight with these guys because he pounded on the wall. For a door, there was just a cloth, but he on it. And he speaks Spanish, and they came to the door, and he was telling them, I know you took our stuff. And did you take our stuff? And they wouldn't admit it first. He says, look, I'm going to come in there. I know you took our stuff. And they admitted it. He said, bring that stuff out here. Bring it out here. And then go over and get that compressor and that generator out of the truck because these are pneumatic tools and they won't work without an air compressor. And the compressor won't work without the generator. So let me show you. Let me hook it all up for you. And he hooked it all up and he put together the tools and he got them and he showed them how to use the tower saw and the guns and the nail guns and the drills and stuff. And he says, these tools don't work without this stuff. You've got to have this stuff to make it work. So what I want you to do is you take this stuff and start working, learn how to use it, and start earning money by using these tools. And he showed them how to do it. And then he invited them to dinner. There's a group of us, and we would eat at a church compound nearby. And he invited them to dinner. And then I said to him as we were driving back, I said, well, we don't have any tools. And he says, that's okay. We'll just drive into Tijuana. It's only 45 minutes away. And they have a Home Depot in Tijuana. And we'll just buy everything, put it on a credit card, and either somebody from my church will pay for it or I'll pay for it. It doesn't make any difference. But they needed the tools more than we do, and we'll get the tools what we need. So we went and bought everything, went back and finished the houses. And those guys came to our dinner that night. Now, I don't know what they got out of it, but we had a speaker who gave the gospel. I don't know if they understood any of it or heard any of it, but what I do know is they were introduced to the gospel. They were introduced to Christian men being authentic. See, John stood up. He didn't stood up to beat him up. He could have. He stood up to be an ambassador for Jesus, to further the kingdom. That's what he was standing for, and that's what I learned from him. And there are a lot of stories in here about being authentic, and there's a lot of stories in here about being inauthentic. I've been both. I think I'm authentic now, but I've been inauthentic in the past, and I haven't been effective. And Jesus, I think, is going to talk to me about that. And there was a time, Tim, when we weren't walking together, but now I know now where I have to stand, when I have to show up, and what I need to do, because I am going to be at that tip of the sword, hopefully with all of you. Thank you. Let me pray. Heavenly Father, I know that this didn't go as I planned it for this morning. But you talked to me through some of my friends yesterday, and said, don't worry about it, because I was really down, and you know it, God, that I had been kicked in the stomach again. But through the men that you've put in my life, I was just told, Tim, you don't need to worry about tomorrow. Just be yourself and tell your story. And it was that, dear Heavenly Father, that you were able to share some of what's going on in my heart with these men, and hopefully that you'll keep me on the right path and keep me at the tip of that spear along with these men. I pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.